Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. For today's cast, we have another developer interview lined up. He is the creator behind the Metroidvania roguelike, A Robot Named Fight, and he's also working on the upcoming game Kop Killer 22XX, and those all with Ks, that is currently in early access as we speak. So please welcome, from Morningstar Game Studio, Matt Bitner. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on, Josh.
Yep, it is a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for reaching out about Kop Killer, and definitely excited to talk to you because I was a huge fan of A Robot Named Fight.
Good to know. I think Cop Killer, which just came out, has a lot of the same DNA as A Robot Named Fight, even though they're very different games.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And we certainly have a lot to discuss. So, since this is your first time on the cast, Matt, for people watching who don't know who you are or what is A Robot Named Fight, could you give us kind of like a brief rundown of what is kind of like your background in game dev, and also what's the elevator pitch for a robot?
Yeah, so I'll start with my background in game dev, which has maybe been about a decade now. I worked for a mobile game studio here in Kentucky. That's where I'm from. Called HitSense, and we made a handful of games. Draw Stickman Epic, Battle Pillars, or some of the names of those games. Some of them eventually got ported to console, but then I left and went off on my own to create A Robot Named Fight. A Robot Named Fight is a roguelike Metroidvania. We call it a Metroguelike, which is probably a mouthful. Probably a bad mashup before it's there, but that's what we've been calling it. And it is essentially like, I am a huge fan of Super Metroid, and the game is in many ways a love letter to that game, from the controls and even like the door transitions and a lot of other things. Like, it is clear the influence that game has on it. But the other big influence would be Binding of Isaac, with its roguelike progression and the way that as you achieve different things, content begins to unlock that appears in your run. So yeah, with A Robot Named Fight, it's a mashup of those two things, and it's trying to create this randomized Metroidvania dungeon where every gate is blocked by a progression item that you need to find in this kind of labyrinth to progress. And the plot surrounds a planet of robots being invaded by this giant kind of meat monster, and it unfolds from there to become a little less black and white.
Mm-hmm. And on this side, as you were talking about with kind of the Metroidvania gates for a robot, that was something that I found very interesting, because or for people watching, you know that I've certainly played quite a bit in terms of action roguelikes, but it's kind of a little bit rarer to see one that is structured around the Metroidvania aspects. And I was wondering if you could go to maybe like a little bit more detail about what was it like to kind of, I guess, build the game in your head of how you wanted like a typical run to unfold in terms of combining like the Metroidvania upgrades with the traditional like action roguelike upgrades of here's more health, here's more damage, and so on.
Yeah, I think like it was a tricky balance between like finding the right number of items to be what I'll call progression items. Those are items that you actually need to progress the game, and then items that are more to kind of customize your build and like change your style of play, but they don't really influence your progression. Well, they don't keep you from moving forward in the game.
Mhm.
So very early on, I started to think, like, the very first draft of the game even was, it was a Metroidvania where there were like 7 different colored doors and a power up that gave you a different color beam, and it was just kind of this maze. I had to create this algorithm to create this maze where you just simply had doors, and from there I kind of backward engineered it to be, well, doors are boring, so let's add sliding, let's add double jumping, let's add dashing, or these different other kind of movement options. And then to add the roguelike element, look at like, okay, well, if we got double jump, what's another way to do that? And so there's kind of these slots for these meta abilities that get traded out. And a fun thing, like, if you ever want to know more, I released the source code to the whole game not long ago. So it's all there for anyone to read now.
Mm-hmm. And like from a design standpoint, like how did you settle on like which like meta progressions you want to include? Like for people who didn't play Robot Named Fight, you have a double jump, you have like the infinite jump or the gravity jump, you have jetpacks and so on. So there's a lot of different solutions to the same problem of like getting around the obstacles.
Yeah, I think making that decision was like the we didn't I didn't want to set order, right? Like I wanted there to be these opportunities for you to play one time and you get slide or you get your arachnomorph, whatever, where you can get under small gaps first. But the next time you play, that's not necessarily the first thing you run into. That was very important. But then there were other abilities, like you mentioned, Jump, where if you get that ability, then double jump's useless. If you get that ability, then like hover jump or any of these things that augment your jump are pretty useless because now you can fly. So creating these structures that like drilled down into exactly what an item was and then like kind of having data about each item to make those decisions was like one of the first things that had to get done in the game before like all the content could get created. So there's this period where the game was just kind of these boring rooms connected by these different gates and progression items and just getting all that to function. And then it really came alive when we started adding the content into that empty shell, I guess.
Yeah, and I've spoken to a few developers who worked on Metroidvania design over like the last year or so. I spoke with a developer who did Haku the Robot, and one of the more fascinating parts of our chat was kind of breaking down kind of the structure of the world and how he laid out. Okay, so this area you can only access with a slide, and then you get the slide, you can unlock a increased jump, and then this part of the world opens up. And with a robot named Five, like with its structure, you had kind of like each one of the biomes set up around like a particular progression gate. In terms of building like the overall world, what was that kind of like in terms of figuring out? Okay, I want the player to go here first, and then go here, and then fight this guy to then go up here for the finale.
With the very first launch of the game, we actually had a problem with that. Like it was kind of stale. We had what we called or when I say we, it's basically me, my wife, and then the fans of the game that we were all talking these things over. But the upside down E problem was I'd kind of designed it in such a way to where you move through this city, and then it loops around and you loop back up to go to the city. So it's just kind of like one direction down and then back up in a loop. So we had this, I guess, like meta pattern of the layout, and the biomes could be kind of shuffled around in that, but it always mirrored this upside down E. So one of the first things that came out, I think a year after launch, was a patch that created these new kind of meta layouts or these new concepts of like, here's the rough block where this biome's going to be, and here are the rough, like some decision points of where they're going to be connected.
Mhm.
And then you drilled down further and you made those connections and then drilled down further. So, like, and then we introduced alternate biomes too, which added a lot more
Mhm.
like fun to it, where like these larger chunks could be swapped out. So it was like studying how a traditional Metroidvania is designed, and then trying to create an algorithm that could do each step of that in a generic enough way. And I mean, it doesn't have the same charm of a handmade Metroidvania. I don't think like it doesn't quite achieve that.
Mhm.
Um, but it's something I want to explore in the future, anyways. Like it's something I always think about. Like there's not those interesting moments. I'm sorry to keep rambling, but like the bomb gate in Meridia and Super Metroid, or some spots in Hollow Knight where you might kill a boss and then can get through to another area and it links up the world in a different way. Like there's certain things you can't really do with the roguelike structure, but I think I don't know. Maybe there's some way to do those in the future.
Oh yeah, we could have a whole chat about procedural generation, but we'll be here for like another hour just on that one
Yeah.
topic alone. And in terms of, I guess, expanding the game, one thing that I want to ask you about, I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that while you were developing a robot named Fight, a lot of the funding came from like you highlighting a Patreon campaign for it.
Yeah, we were running a Patreon. Like we got to the end of a Robot Named Fight's development, and I kind of started up the Patreon around the end of that, and started up like Twitch streaming live development. So like people would just tune in and chat with me while I would do the pixel art for new bosses and things like that. Like we launched a Robot Named Fight. When I say we again, it's basically me and my wife. When I ran out of money. Like we had a really tight kind of shoestring budget, and we kind of ran out of money, and the game was at a point where it's like, okay, this could come out. And then we funded like the perpetual development of it through Patreon and through we had a coffee site where you could just drop tips.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to always do all the updates for free, just because I didn't want anybody to like miss out on any of the experience. So, in retrospect, it probably should have been early access, which Kop Killer is in early access right now. So, and that's kind of how that game's going to be delivered in chunks. But
Mm-hmm.
again, that was the thinking behind that.
And the reason why I want to ask you about that is, for a lot of my audience, include a lot of indie developers and first timers who are, of course, looking for any and every which way to develop a game. I was just wondering, like, what was it like to use Patreon, I guess, like, as your source of income while you were developing more content for a robot?
It was honestly really great, especially in the beginning. Like it's kind of fallen off recently. As I started focusing on other games, I released Carl actually in between A Robot Named Fight and Kop Killer 22XDX. Released this little charming platformer with my friend Nintendo called Carl. And during that time, the Patreon kind of slowed down. But right after launch, when we were really putting out updates constantly, everything was great. Because you'd get feedback directly. I could do like secret video releases and things like that. And the game itself was making money at that time too. So it really, I think, kept the project breathing and alive enough to get to the state where it is today, and also like get a physical release on Switch and all these other things. Like, I don't know, it was ultimately positive. Um, I think Patreon's changed a bit since then. This was 5 years ago, so I don't know how it is now exactly. Like, I've not used it as much, but
Yeah, and that's another topic for another day for sure.
yeah.
And I guess keeping with A Robot Named Fight, another thing that I want to ask you about in terms of the updates and adding in more content after launch, because this is something that I think is another very interesting aspect, specifically around roguelikes in particular. A good roguelike is usually kept to a very specific run length, and you typically don't see content that gets added that, let's say, oh, it's a 40-minute run, now it's a 75-minute run, or now it becomes a 3-hour run. In
Yeah.
terms of, I guess, deciding how you wanted to expand a robot with the additional updates and more content, what was kind of like the thought process or your general strategy, what you wanted to see added to the game?
We took the same kind of, I think, route as a Binding Name Isaac, or sorry, a Binding Name, the Binding of Isaac, where you there was a first boss, right? Like there was a first final boss, and then there were multiple final bosses after that. And to keep the run length kind of contained, um, there were paths to those final bosses where you never really did three in a row. Later on, people figured out how to do all three in a row, so I had to add content for that. But like keeping it confined to these specific biomes and actually like having hard coded like kind of maximum lengths on the biome's actual room, like the distances between each room, kind of honed that in a bit. I guess where it deviates from the standard roguelike a little is that you could do as much exploration as you want. You can 100% the whole map, and you're encouraged to do so. So that kind of throws a wrench in those gears, I guess. And then later on, like in the final release, we added Mega Map, which is just an alternate mode. Like if you want to play a roguelike for 3 hours, you can. If you want to, if you want to have a very long run, you can with that mode, but it's nothing we force on. So we're still able to add things in, and that we just take something out and shuffle a new thing in. To keep the length, that kind of like tight, ideal hour and a half run length. Sometimes shorter. Like the shortest runs of a Robot Named Fight are crazy. They can be really short.
Oh yeah, I don't think I ever did like the speedrun challenge in Robot, but I did play quite a bit. I think one of my best runs was maybe like around an hour of getting through it, but that was definitely not by the final update. I think that was like a little bit earlier with some of this stuff. And I guess keeping with like the structure of it, in terms of balance, I know the game can definitely fluctuate in terms of difficulty, especially again what upgrades you get and which ones show up where. What was, I guess, like your thoughts, or what was the structure in terms of how hard did you want to make a Robot Named Fight, especially with some of the boss fights too?
That was an incredibly difficult question to answer because Metroidvanias tend to keep their difficulty on the lower end, right? Because there's so much backtracking and there's so much like exploration is the focus. And you don't want a game where you're dying every 5 minutes if exploration is the focus. And that's antithetical to the roguelike where like typically those games are pretty hard. Typically those games are pretty difficult. So we tried to find this middle ground on launch, and it ended up being a little too easy, I think, according to most feedback. Some people found it very hard. Like Metroidvania fans found it like, oh, this is a little too difficult. But then like roguelike fans were like, oh, it's pretty easy for a roguelike. So we ended up kind of cranking the difficulty up a little and then counteracting that by like the longer you want to spend in the world finding all these secrets, the greater your power gets. So if you spend a long time and you are a Metroidvania player, you have that option to like explore and really max out your build. But if you're this kind of roguelike speedrun mindset, you can also do that. It's just going to be a lot harder.
And as one bit of question about the procedural generation, does the game spawn the same amount of passive upgrades each run, or is that randomly shuffled? And what I mean by the passive upgrades, I mean like the health, attack speed, attack damage, those ones.
Yeah, it's always the same number, but not the same contents. So it's not like we, there's damage, there's health, there's speed, let's say. It's not like we always spawn 5 of each. We kind of, it's in a range of like, okay, there's going to at least be some damage, but that can be within this range. And then we fill in each kind of pool and then shuffle it and scatter it all over the map. You could think of it that way. So there's always a set number of passable upgrades, but what they are varies pretty wildly.
And with the actual boss designs, I just want to get your thoughts on like building like the actual like fixed encounters, because as you were saying, one of the challenges of kind of like that intersection between a roguelike and a Metroidvania is a roguelike is supposed to be random. You don't know what your attack strength is going to be on this run. While Metroidvania is, of course, say, okay, we know by World 3 you're going to have this, this, and this. And I remember from my time playing a robot, some of the boss fights did get very easy, and then there were some that definitely drove me up a wall, especially if I didn't get enough attack upgrades, such as the mothership fight, or the meat mothership. If you didn't have enough damage or spread you all that stuff, it got very tricky.
Yeah, it was difficult to design bosses around, because again, like most really good Metroidvania bosses have some way you can use all these cool abilities you've gained to like fight them. Like I'm thinking of the Kraid fight in the new Metroid Dread. Like that has some cool ways that you're using Warfall and things like that. So we couldn't design bosses to depend on certain items without designing tons and tons and tons and tons of bosses, right? More bosses than I could do alone. And at the time I was making the game alone. So we had to design bosses like the one in the forest, I forget the name, Oozeheart, where you can slide underneath their form, or you could crawl underneath, or the Arachnomorph, but kind of designing bosses with these slots where certain abilities could be useful. A lot of the swoopy, jumpy ones are much easier to face if you have a double jump, or you have a hover boots, or any of these things that give you that extra height on your jump, but they're going to be way harder if you don't. So it contributes to the randomness, but also like plays into the Metroidvania, hopefully. It's one of those things, I don't know, I feel like we didn't quite nail it in a Robot Named Fight, and I really want to like improve upon that, I think, in the future.
And again, it's just very tricky. I'm currently writing a book on RPG design. For those of you watching this in the future, hopefully it'll be finished writing by the time this podcast goes up. And part of that challenge, again, is you never know exactly, especially when you have randomized upgrades, what is the player going to have? And unless, of course, you kind of really like narrow that kind of the spectrum of what can show up, but then that, of course, ruins the roguelike nature. If the player knows, oh, I will always have 4 attack upgrades before this boss, well then, it's going to be a very easy fight. And like with a robot, one of the things I did enjoy, again, and I think as you've been mentioning a binding, I almost call it a binding name Isaac as well. That may be a good spin-off title if you want, if we can get Edmund on for that. But with a robot named Fight, is that the different attack weapons or the different attack upgrades greatly influence what you're going to be doing. Like the fourth area, I believe, the kind of like underground mine part or the
Hmm.
underground city, that part can become very nasty if you don't have some really good attacks or just having enough movement tech. Like there's a very big difference going through that area with a double jump versus having the jetpack to avoid all those
Right.
spikes all over the place.
That is almost like you mentioned Binding of Isaac, and they do that too. With like
Mm.
the later levels end up having spikes all over the floor. So
Oh
if you don't have
yes.
flying by that point, it's going to be a lot harder. So a Robot Named Fight, we did the same thing with traversability. Like there's the platforms that disintegrate in that final area. There's a lot of like you need to stay in the air, you need to move quickly. That becomes a lot easier if you get these things where you get a grace period, hover boots, double jump, those kind of things.
Hmm. And then, of course, for being the fourth area, you get kind of like the game's final progression item, which is usually something that gives you some form of an infinite jump or just endless jump.
Yeah, it's always some kind of flight item. Like it's something that either lets you like hover indefinitely, or like you said, the infinite jump is really great to get. And I forget there's a third one that we added later, but I forget what it is now because there's 140 items in the game, so
And
I keep track of them all.
that actually brings up an interesting question I wanted to ask you. Again, like speaking about the Binding of Isaac, I spoke with Edmund about kind of his thoughts to kind of item balance, and his idea was just basically, I don't care. Like if you want to have a run where you get every single attack upgrade and the basic bullet just stomps everything, he said go nuts. With a robot named Fight, as we were saying earlier, you have all the different kinds of passive upgrades, but they're never really put into like a fixed line of what you're going to get. I wanted to just ask you, like, what was like your thoughts about, I guess, how powerful could a player get? I remember one of my favorite ones. I think I got like the Mega Shot, the one that like makes your bullets like super big. I was just like going, let me just shoot that bullet, it's like boom, and it just like kills everything. So, like, in terms of, like, I guess, making the game breakable in that respect, in terms of balance, like, how did you decide upon that?
Like I think again, we it was similar to the philosophy behind a Binding of Isaac. The only thing different is we did have a lower floor. Like I didn't want you to get to the later stages and for enemies to feel too spongy,
Mm-hmm.
or for the challenge to be just because it's going to take longer. That's the other thing is our game took longer than the average
Yeah.
roguelike. So we want to give a little more of a grace period of like you can't die as easily in those later areas without making multiple mistakes. Like we didn't want to have where you can make one mistake and die. But as far as the upper limit goes, um, as high as you can get, like I've seen people one shot the Mega Beast in the final world. Like you can fill up the screen with bullets to where you can't see. You can just like fly around and just you don't even have to fire. It's almost like Vampire Survivors where stuff is just coming off you at all times. So um on that end, like I think that's the funnest part of roguelikes is like the slot machine effect. If you play again and again and again, and eventually you land on that run where it's just like, oh, finally, I'm gonna get way further than I've ever been. That's just I don't know. I enjoy that when I play roguelikes. So
Mm-hmm. And in terms of powering up, one thing I just want to ask you, I guess this will be more a quicker question. One of the things that's interesting about Robot Named Fight compared to some of the other Metroidvanias is that you always have kind of like on the little mini map HUD the secret indicator, or you'll always have that little dollar, if you're in a room with a secret. Was that a decision that was made like very early into the game's development, or was that something that you thought about implementing like after like 1.0 or after playtesting?
I think that was there from the beginning. Like it was just always something I appreciated in other Metroidvanias I played, Super Metroid being the most notable one. Um, is where you knew to look. Like knowing to look in a room is useful. I
Yeah.
think like it incentivizes exploration. So I always wanted that there. I think when we changed the UI a little, and I think we drew a little more attention to it later on. Again, I keep saying we. I forget at the time it was just me. But yeah, yeah.
All right. And I know in terms of the time check, we got about another like 40 minutes, give or take, before we're at our time, maybe a little bit less than that. With regards to a robot named Fight, from a design standpoint, anything else that we didn't touch on that you would like to discuss?
I'm trying to think, like, I guess to kind of transition over to the new game, Kop Killer 22XDX, there are like, I guess the plot and premise of a robot named Fight explores some strange things in the fact that like you kind of discover towards the end that you're the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Like you are a sinister force that has previously kind of carried out a kind of genocide against the previous human race, and then uh, you're getting your comeuppance when the game begins, I suppose, for kind of the
Mm-hmm.
unfolding there. I was curious. You played the game. Do you have any thoughts on the plot itself, or the like? It's a very slim plot. There's not a lot of plot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Until it's all in the background and it's all kind of optional.
Yeah. I did find it interesting, and I guess for people watching, this will be a somewhat of a bit of a spoiler alert in
Yeah, I
terms of the
suppose. Sorry,
story.
I should preface that.
But when you add in, or like the, I guess the game's, I guess quote unquote true final fight, when you're inside the mothership and you're fighting, what looks to be like that, like a creature from like what was it, 2001: A Space Odyssey kind
Sure,
of
yeah, yeah.
fight.
It's like the people in the strange
Yeah,
cosmic egg looking thing. Yeah,
yeah. I did find it very interesting that you kill it and it reveals to be, oh, it's like the last two humans, and like, oh wait, what? Like, and like, and then you learn more, a little bit more about like human society when you go down. You fight like kind of like the mole people in the
yeah.
fourth section. Yeah, but yeah, it was definitely interesting. And it's always hard, I think, to do like interesting stories in a roguelike structure. Like the only game I can think of that I think nailed it the most probably be Supergiant Games Hades, and that game again, like the story was just 100% like married to the roguelike progression.
Yeah, that was a very good game. I haven't played all of it yet, but what I've played of it's very good. Like, I really enjoyed it.
And I guess before we switch over to talking about Kop Killer, are there any plans or any thoughts about more content from a robot named Fight in the future, or do you consider the game to, I think, be like officially wrapped up at this point?
It's on a kind of indefinite hiatus at the moment. Like I will never abandon that game, and there are definitely like thematic connections, oddly enough, between a robot named Fight and Cop Killer 22XDX. Um, but for now, I can't promise any new content for it. That doesn't mean there won't be. Like there probably will be. I know there will be, but nothing that I can really talk about right now. So like, don't hold your breath on new robot named Fight content, but there will be some sometime in the future.
All right. And you said earlier you released the source code for free for a
Yeah.
robot. Have there been any like interesting mods or anything fan created that you want to give a shout out to?
The only thing I'll mention right now is we've got our Discord, discord.gg, Morningstar Game Studio, I think it is. We changed it recently. You can find it on the internet, but go there and a person has created like a seed generator basically where you can kind of create your own run by like selecting the item progression you want, and they've been doing racing with that where like everybody you start with the same seeds and then people progress through it as fast as they can, but they know they're going to get these items, so you can kind of engineer kind of silly runs just by setting the item pool up with this seed generator, and that's maybe the coolest thing that's come out so far. I haven't seen a lot else, but it's out there if you're interested in making a roguelike Metroidvania. um, it's all there, including like all the assets, all the graphics, and like the sounds and art and everything.
And there's a greater discussion I've been thinking about in the back of my mind about having more like randomizers and more elements in Metroidvanias. I know Axiom Verge got like like a roguelike mode. Like it was officially added or randomized. I think it was either last year or the year before that. And as someone who's been watching like more speedrunners and like looking more into that side, I would love to see more games like that get like those kinds of elements, because it just seems both like a fascinating way and just like a completely destructive way to like mess with the progression of your game.
I had no idea Axiom Verge did that until you just told me right now, and now I want to go play that because that sounds awesome. I really loved Axiom Verge, so like, there's
Oh
a roguelike
yes,
that sounds really fun. I know they had like the random offshoot areas that were kind of randomized or
oh
whatever, but
yes.
I want to play that. That sounds great.
All right. But with that, let us switch over and talk a little bit more about Kop Killer. So the time check is about 30 minutes. So again, maybe like another 20-25 minutes if that works for you.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
with that said, as I said at the start, for people watching us, Kop Killer 22XX is currently out in early access right now. So for people listening to us, what's kind of the elevator pitch for Kop Killer?
So, Kop Killer 22XDX is about a very hopeless, grimdark future where capitalism has reached a point that it's begun to transition towards fascism. Everything has become privatized, and prisoners are basically bought, sold, swapped between private prisons that do open human experimentation and just terrible things. Right? Probably one of the worst futures anyone could imagine. You are a miner that has to. Well, this is kind of all like pre-story. You're a mine worker that works in my head it's a lithium mine, but it could be some kind of future tech where you're basically mining energy resources. But the different cartels that run the globe, like the Americana economy, have like started kind of a price war with their digital script coins. Like they pay everybody in script. So if you know about like old company towns, I'm from Kentucky. We have a lot of miners. So everybody kind of basically has these Disney dollars, these digital Disney dollars, whatever, and the medical cartel of sorts jacks up the price, and they can no longer get the anti-radiation medicine they need to stay alive, essentially. So in that vein, the protagonist of the game, who becomes the Kop Killer, attacks this medical transport with a rock drill and gets arrested and sent to this probably the nastiest prison of the bunch, where they decide to put them in a brainwashing program to turn them into kind of like a cyborg RoboCop of sorts. It's very inspired by Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop. So you start from there, and then you have to bust out of a prison, and then you end up in this factory town, this company town, and the plot kind of unfolds from there. And the story mode's not in the game yet. Right now, it's an arcade mode where you kind of battle in these procedurally generated arenas for a high score. And we're hoping to get the story mode out very soon. It's in early access. It's $3, but we're just looking to have it kind of fan supported, a lot like Robot M Fight was
Mm-hmm.
through Patreon. But we want to like get it out there first.
And with like coming up with the concept for Cop Killer, where did like that start from? I know for this one you are working with another developer, Doctor Shameless Cat, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Shameless Cat's a friend of mine from Europe, and we've been working on AI, basically, AI controlled enemies and AI controlled components. Uh, and we kept playing around with this, and we had these cool systems in place, but we really didn't know the direction to go with the game. And then right before the pandemic in March, uh, Breonna Taylor was murdered by the Louisville Metro Police Department. Um, and I mean, I think it's obvious the game has some overt political themes. Like I don't. That shouldn't be a secret with a title like Top Killer 22XDX. So I'm more than happy to talk about any of that. But like after that particular incident and how horrific it was and how tied up it was in the like well, I don't want to go on a too long rant because that's a show about games, but just the property development in Louisville, it was tied to that. Like it was tied to these much bigger things that never really got fully discussed, and just the connections between capitalism and police violence. Like that's the thing we both decided we wanted to explore because we were both locked down for the pandemic and we had a big long amount of time to just talk about stuff. And it started almost as like a joke. We were like, we're gonna do Smash TV. We're mad. We're gonna make this Smash TV thing called Kop Killer. And then the more we talked, the more it came into this like coherent plot that we could really convey what I think are interesting ideas. Maybe not fun ideas, like, but it's pretty dark. But I think ideas worth expressing, anyways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's certainly that is certainly a topic in terms of trying to explore these themes within games. Because I know there are some people out there who don't like that, and there are some people who want to see more of like those kinds of discussions when it comes to like the stories we're telling.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, especially for a game with the politics that this game has, Some people, like, the initial response, it's not even that they disagree with the politics of the game. They just don't want politics there, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're just like, oh, I don't want it in my game. When most games have politics, Call of Duty has
Mm-hmm.
politics all over it, you know? Like,
Yeah.
but if it's politics that match your own or kind of jive with your ideology, then you kind of swim in it like water and you don't notice it as such. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. It's been
Yeah.
weird. Been an
Oh yes. Now with the general gameplay of Cop Killer, I did have a chance to play the arcade mode. I think this will be like last week or the week before the time of this recording, and I was enjoying it. It did feel like a little like clunky in terms of like kind of like the melee combat and dealing with some of the enemies. In terms of I guess like how the game is going to grow, like what are some aspects that you're looking at adding in? Of course, you mentioned the story mode a few minutes ago.
Yeah. So with arcade mode, it is kind of roguelike. And we've heard the feedback about the melee as well, where like it kind of stops your momentum when you punch, and that's
Mm-hmm.
carried over from beat 'em ups. But
Mm-hmm.
it's this strange mix of beat 'em up and platformer. So I don't know if we've really nailed it yet. So we're definitely looking at tweaking like the responsiveness of different things. One big thing that I think a lot of people have mentioned that we're going to add in is being able to interrupt your melee attacks with a jump or with some other things. Because right now you can't really, and I think that's classic for say a Streets of Rage or something like that. But in this game, it doesn't quite work, so we need to tweak it.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, like we want to add, there's going to be at least two more large environment sets, and within each of those environment sets, maybe like four or five different environments. The current arcade mode, I think there are four kind of sub environments of this prison, and the arcade mode will feature either of those, and each of those will be tied to the story mode, which will have like a fully playable hand design campaign. That will we currently don't plan for it to be a Metroidvania, but it will have aspects of exploration reminiscent of that. So it won't be like a true Metroidvania, but it will have things you'll want to revisit and power ups that will give you some movement abilities and like I don't know. We want to do a lot with it. It's probably a little
Mm-hmm.
ambitious for two people, but I think we can
Mm-hmm.
get there.
Cool. And I do want to ask you more about the story mode, but I guess to give you a little bit of feedback from me, like one of the things that I found with like kind of the melee combat that was kind of throwing me off. It may be hard to explain, but I'll try to. It was kind of like if I run at the enemy and the enemy stops, they will always stop right outside of my melee range. So it's
Yeah,
kind of like that kind of like brief moment of okay, they stop, but I still have to move just like that tiny like millimeter forward before I can actually punch him, or the guy will hit me from his range. I think that kind of felt like a little frustrating until you pick up like the baton, which then of course gives you that just that little extra attack range.
that's been part of the roguelike design of things
Mm-hmm.
is like creating these kind of uncomfortable situations that you want answers for, right?
Yeah.
You want solutions to. And I do hear what you're saying where they stop. That's actually programmed in. Like if you button mash, the enemy won't walk into your punching. They'll back up a little bit. And we've done a
Mm-hmm.
lot with AI in that regard. I think we can tweak it to be a little more forgiving. And I don't know when you played if it was more than 2 or 3 weeks ago. Um, we've
Probably.
we've added something now where you do maintain a bit of momentum if you're holding the stick in one direction or another and punching. So like um we've heard that feedback and I think we're trying to fix it. Which is cool. I mean that's one of the great things about early access is all the like when we get stuff wrong we can fix it.
Yeah, and again, like it's one of the challenges of when you're making like a very action or very kinetic based game and making that feel right.
Yeah.
So with the story mode of Cop Killer, I guess as you said, like it's not going to be a Metroidvania. Will there be any kind of procedural aspects, or is it going to be just 100% handmade?
At the moment we intend for it to be 100% handmade. But that doesn't mean we won't introduce later modes with more procedural aspects. Like the arcade mode's always going to have that procedural aspect. And I've talked and we've brainstormed about other things, just nothing we can promise on yet. But the story mode that comes out will be pretty much hand designed. We're gonna have some adjustable difficulties, and there's gonna be a lot of like uh, instances of player choice. But so it won't be linear, but it will be all designed by hand. I think.
And like going from a robot named Fight, when you're thinking about the game from a procedural standpoint, how is it thinking about Kop Killer and now going back to like a linear standpoint?
Um, it's oddly liberating, if you believe it. Like with the procedural generation of a robot named Fight, there were a lot of limitations about what kinds of things you could do, what you could rely on the player to understand, because you couldn't with the procedural generation, you can't even introduce the player to things sequentially so they understand like this component and then the next and then the next. Like to a degree you can by segmenting things into environments and stuff, but like that level of control we want to use really well in Kop Killer, to where like we can tie things together in ways you just can't in a procedurally generated game. I'm trying to think of specific aspects, but like I guess the biggest one is like the notion of one-way doors, like the notion of like you go through this door and you can't go back. We don't need to let you go back, but then maybe you find a way around later. That's a little abstract, but yeah. So it's just really freeing in that we can do a lot more and we can have a lot more complexity within the individual levels.
Mm-hmm. And for right now, of course, the game is played single player. Is there any thoughts about having like a local co-op or any kind of like cooperative mode?
I am not comfortable saying that's coming, but that's probably coming. Like we've had a lot of conversations. People have asked for it. It's set up to work already because you in the game. I guess one of the bigger components of it is you collect these comrades. You kind of like recruit people to your team, and eventually you have this squad of 4 or 5 people, and they each have special abilities. We've talked about a kind of Sonic 2 co-op mode where just somebody can pick up another controller and control any of these other comrades as you would Tails and Sonic. So just the ability to kind of jump in and jump out co-op we've talked about, I think would really be fun, especially in arcade mode. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's definitely something we're considering. We just got to figure out how to do it right.
And with kind of like growing the gameplay itself, with the arcade mode, as you said, like that is currently in the game. Will that, besides getting like new content or like new levels, are you going to be kind of like growing that concurrently with the story mode?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like we've talked about like one thing missing right now in arcade mode is bosses, right? There aren't really bosses. There are tough enemies. There's these kind of what we call heavy enemies, borrowing kind of from the design of Doom Eternal. Like there's those, but we want to add like legitimate bosses, and we've got to create them for story mode. And as we create them for story mode, they filter into arcade mode. And as we create like the AI, currently we're working on getting it to handle moving platforms and then moving hazards, and as that enters story mode it kind of filters into arcade mode, so every new like feature we implement in one mode ends up in the other, and they kind of build on each other in that way. So there will definitely be like we want a potpourri mode eventually where it mixes all the environments together and all kinds of things. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there. We're looking like arcade mode is like Vampire Survivors in a lot of ways. Like that's one thing we're looking at, but it's also not in that it's not. It's constant action rather than just idling with one stick. It's use 12 buttons, use 10. So yeah.
All right. And in terms of, I guess, a timeline for it, as we said, like Kop Killer was released about like 2, 3 weeks ago, give or take, by the time we're recording this.
Actually, yeah, yesterday was a week ago.
Ooh,
Yeah,
damn,
it's
time
been out
really
a week.
does fly, it doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's felt like 3 weeks to me too.
But for people listening to us right now, what kind of timeline are you thinking about in terms of updates, or do you have like a idea of when you're hoping to get things implemented?
So we're thinking of doing like what we're calling like quality of life updates or like minor updates. I guess those are the three types of updates: quality of life, minor, and major. We've already done a quality of life update, less than a week, and then we're gonna do I think a minor update, hopefully sometime into this month, next month, where we add some things to arcade mode and tweak the balance a little bit. And we've talked about trying to get story mode out by the end of May, but we're 2 people, and that could totally not happen. So it's not like a hard deadline, but we'd like to get what we're calling major updates out every 2 to 4 months. I know it's a big window, but um, I think it's going to come together a lot quicker as we get more systems in place. Like the version of the game we have now has all the structure, and now we've just got to kind of add the content.
All right. And I guess with regards to Kop Killer, anything else from a design standpoint that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up?
Um, well, I suppose like the way we integrate these heavier themes and these heavier topics into the story in a way that it's still a video game and not a movie or not a book you watch, like a lot
Mm-hmm.
of I'm not a fan of games where there are a ton of cutscenes, where there are a ton of moments where you just kind of absorb information passively. So there's not a lot of story content out there. Story mode's not out, but there is the tutorial, and we've tried to do that with the tutorial where you're playing through this very traumatic experience of being indoctrinated by this kind of fascist police force, and everything is very unpleasant. I would say, like it's an odd experience for a tutorial, and I think it's maybe a little heavy up front. But that's the only I guess that's the only other thing that we hadn't done before. That we're trying to do now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is very hard for some of these games to balance that. As you said, there's a lot of titles that will just stop everything and just, explain to the player and you can't do anything. And sometimes it's very hard to marry that to the gameplay loops of what you're trying to get the player to do.
Yeah, and I think you can do it wrong too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we've already revised the tutorial just because the content itself read incorrectly. Like, it came across, and well, being perfectly candid, like some of it came across as racist, like us being racist rather than this framed entity in the
Mm-hmm.
game being racist. So just balancing all that and making it this experience that you participate in rather than just absorb, and then
Mm-hmm.
also like making sure you do that correctly. It's a lot of I don't know, it's a big challenge. Hopefully we're not doing it too shabby.
Yeah, like at the end of the tutorial, there's that point where you can either kill the unarmed person, or you kind of go to the left and you kind of break the tutorial. Like, it's a spoiler alert again for people
Yeah.
watching. Like, I wonder how many people miss like that kind of split that you can just go to the left and kind of break it.
Well, we've actually revised the tutorial 3 times, and the first one was to make that path more obvious. So it
Mhm.
used to be, without giving away too many spoilers. Again, this is the first 5 minutes of the game, so I'm not too concerned.
Mhm.
But there's that path. Now it kind of blinks, and now you can kind of see behind it or whatever. But it used to be a little more hidden. I am assuming you found that path and went through it.
Yeah, pretty much. Like the second I saw
So,
like, that little like portal, or like, okay, that must be where I need to go.
so a thing that's always been the case is you can't kill that child. Like that would
Mhm.
be insane to kill a child. So we don't actually allow the player to do that. That's the point where um if you attempt to do that, you get hurt and the game kind of breaks down and glitches out and acts
Mhm.
strange to represent like the psychic break and being confronted with that choice. But it's also avoidable, like you said. So we fine tuned that a lot because that was a part of the game I was very concerned with. Like I didn't want that to be fun, which is an odd choice to make when designing a video game, but I wanted that to be a little weird. So we've messed with a lot. There's now music cues and a lot of other stuff that happens if you choose poorly. I'll put it, but yeah, it's an interesting. I don't know, like that kind of design where you're not necessarily designing for fun, but you're designing for like emotional effect is strange, especially in a game that's 8-bit, right?
Yeah.
Like that looks the way our game looks. So.
All right, I guess one final gameplay question for you, Matt, and then we'll kind of go into our wrap up. You
Sure.
mentioned earlier with Kop Killer that you had like the different kind of companions. I played, like I said, I played like during like opening day, so I got the guy who had like the EMP attack.
Mhm.
What's kind of like the bounds, or what are you playing for? Like how you want the different companions to function in the game?
So there's currently 6, and we want them to be wildly different. We had talked about early on, like having them fill roles, like the EMP is kind of crowd control, right?
Hmm.
And early on, we talked about like, well, we could have like 3 different crowd controls and type companions, and you swap them out, and then you have like a health one. There's another one that creates a zone that heals you. Another one that rages into combat and kind of draws like tanks for you. Another one that builds turrets. There's one that flies and shoot, and another one that like is kind of a utility of summoning your comrades back to you. So we decided very early on, like, well, actually no, let's just make them all wildly different. Like and then you were able to configure like the 4 you want with you, kind of like a Final Fantasy party. So as far as what they're able to do, what their special abilities are, as long as it can be accomplished by pressing one button, we're open to it. And we've even talked about like different ways of doing that, like holding the button, or
Mhm.
we briefly entertained like tech attacks where you can combine 2 powers if you hit them close enough, or things like that. So sky's kind of the limit on what they're able to do. We just want to make sure they're fun and they're not a liability. Like in the story mode, it's strange. There are levels where they're following you around, but their AI is good enough that they can dodge bullets and they can time hazards and do those kind of things. So you're not worried about like keeping them alive or misstepping.
All right. So I think with that, I am just about out of questions. Anything else you would like to discuss, either about a robot or Kop Killer, before we say goodnight?
The only other thing I guess I'll bring up is there we have a game called Carl. It's a very fun platformer that I made with a friend of mine. I just want to give it a shout out because it gets lost in the shuffle sometimes, and I'm really proud of it. Like, if you don't like games with political content or dark themes, Carl is the perfect game for you. It's very approachable and wholesome and nice. And I don't know, I wanted to shout that out.
All right, and I'll include a link to the store page for it in the show notes for people watching this.
Well, thank
All
you.
right. So I think with that, we can wrap things up for our chat. Matt, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you, and definitely best of luck with Kop Killer.
Yeah, it's been great chatting with you. Thank you.
And I do love that this name is probably sending like YouTube's algorithm into a fit
Yeah,
every time we
I'm
mention
sorry
it.
your video gets demonetized immediately for all its unforsaken.
But if you are free in the future, man, it would be great to chat with you, especially to talk more about kind of like marrying like the procedural generation with kind of like fixed or handmade content.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll have to do it again.
All right, so before I let you go for tonight, I guess first thing is, do you have anything you would like to plug in terms of social media, places people can check things out, etc., etc.?
Oh yeah, follow us on Twitter at Morningstar_GS or a robot named Fight. We cross post a lot, so you'll see most things. So yeah, visit us at Discord GG Morningstar Game Studio. There's a great community there, and beyond that, we're on Facebook, but no one really uses Facebook anymore. And then our Steam pages: a robot named Fight, Kop Killer 22XDX, and Carl.
Sounds good. So my final question then for you, Matt, is: do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans to take us out for tonight?
Um, I just want to thank everybody that plays our games for playing our games, especially the way we make them, where they're heavily influenced by your feedback. Like a robot named Fight grew because of the community behind a robot named Fight, and we're hoping to do the same thing with Kop Killer 22XDX. So we just really appreciate uh, all your feedback and like accompanying on this journey.
Sounds great. And maybe I'll have a chance to play Coral by the next time we chat, and we can talk more about platforming design then.
Yeah, I'll give you
Uh,
a key.
all right. So, Matt, again, thank you so much for stopping by and chatting with me for today. And yeah, I'll be looking forward to seeing more of Kop Killer and whatever else comes next from you.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
So for everyone watching, thank you so much for tuning in. If you are new to the YouTube stuff, bell ringing, liking, subscribing, be sure to check out our Discord and Patreon. If you are a developer working on an upcoming game or just want to chat about game dev with me, I'm always looking for guests for these shows. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And until our next chat, take care.